The sound of thunder rolled across the parched landscape, like a warning from God himself, and Josephine Olsen pressed one hand against her swollen belly as the first drops of rain began to fall on the dusty streets of Wilcox, Arizona, in the spring of 1887. She stood outside the general store, her other hand gripping the wooden post for support, watching the sky turn from pale blue to an ominous gray that seemed to press down on the earth with malicious intent. The baby inside her kicked hard, as if sensing the change in the air, and Josephine knew with a sinking certainty that this was going to be a storm unlike any she had seen in her 22 years of life. "Madam, you should get inside," a deep voice said behind her, and she turned to see a tall cowboy with dust-covered boots and concerned eyes the color of summer grass. He carried supplies in both arms but had stopped to address her, his sun-weathered face creased with genuine worry. "That sky means business, and you being in your condition and all." Josephine tried to smile, though another contraction rippled through her lower back, making her breath catch. "I was just heading home," she managed to say, though home was 3 miles outside of town, a small cabin she had shared with her husband until a mining accident had taken him 6 months ago. The baby was all she had left of Thomas, and she was determined to bring this child into the world even if she had to do it alone. The cowboy set down his supplies on the covered porch and took a step closer, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Name is Kane Jackson, madam. I work the cattle drive that came through yesterday. We are camped just north of here, but I do not think you should try to make it anywhere in this weather. Where do you live?" "The old Olsen place, past Cottonwood Creek," Josephine said, and she saw his expression change immediately. Everyone in the territory knew about Cottonwood Creek. It was a dry wash most of the year, a thin trickle during the best times, but when the rains came hard in the mountains, it could swell to a raging torrent in minutes. "I know what you are thinking, but I have supplies to get home and my chickens need tending." Kane Jackson looked at the sky again, and Josephine could see him calculating odds in his head like any experienced frontiersman would do. "Madam, I do not mean to be forward, but when did you last feel that baby move?" "Just now," Josephine said, confused by the question. "Why do you ask?" "Because I have been around enough ranch animals to know when birthing time is near, and I see you wincing," Kane said bluntly. "How far apart are your pains?" Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks, mortified that a stranger had noticed what she had been trying to hide even from herself. The pains had started this morning. A dull ache, she had convinced herself, was simply the baby settling lower, preparing for a birth that was still weeks away according to the doctor in Tucson. But they had grown stronger throughout the day, and now they came with a regularity that frightened her. "I am fine," she insisted, but even as she spoke, another contraction seized her, this one so powerful that her knees buckled. Kane moved with surprising speed for such a large man, catching her before she could fall, his strong arms supporting her weight as if she were no heavier than a child. "We need to get you to the doctor," he said urgently, but Josephine shook her head. "Dr. Morrison left yesterday for Tombstone. His wife took ill." The words came out between gasps as the contraction slowly released its grip. "The midwife, Mrs. Chen, she is on the other side of town." Kane looked down the main street, where rain was now falling in sheets, turning the packed earth into rivers of mud. Already the water was running fast, carrying debris from the hillsides, and Josephine could hear the sound of men shouting as they tried to secure livestock and move wagons to higher ground. The storm had come on so fast that no one had been prepared, and now chaos reigned in the usually peaceful town. "Can you walk?" Kane asked, and Josephine nodded, though she was not entirely certain. He kept one arm around her waist and led her down the steps, moving carefully through water that was already ankle-deep. They made it halfway down the street before Josephine felt something give way inside her, followed by a warm rush of fluid that she knew meant there would be no stopping what was coming. "The baby," she gasped, gripping Kane's arm so hard her fingernails dug into his shirt. "The baby is coming now." Kane's face went pale beneath his tan, but he did not panic. Instead, he scanned the street with quick efficiency, looking for shelter, for help, for anything that might serve their desperate need. The water was rising faster than seemed possible, already rushing past their calves. And in the distance, Josephine could hear a sound like continuous thunder that she realized was the creek flooding its banks. "The church," Kane said, pointing to a white building on a slight rise at the end of the street. "It is on higher ground. Can you make it?" Josephine had no choice but to try. With Kane supporting most of her weight, they struggled through the flood, fighting the current that wanted to sweep their legs out from under them. Other people rushed past, carrying children and precious belongings, everyone seeking safety from the unprecedented deluge. Rain pelted them so hard it stung exposed skin, and lightning cracked across the sky with such violence that Josephine felt it in her bones. They were 20 feet from the church when the wall of water hit. Josephine heard Kane shout a warning, felt him grab her and pull her against his chest, wrapping his body around hers protectively as the flood surge from Cottonwood Creek slammed into the main street with the force of a locomotive. The water lifted them both, carrying them in a tumbling chaos of debris and foam, and Josephine felt Kane's arms tighten around her, refusing to let go even as the current tried to tear them apart. Something solid struck Josephine's shoulder, sending pain shooting through her arm, but Kane twisted his body to take the brunt of other impacts, using himself as a shield. She could not breathe, could not think, could only hold onto consciousness by sheer force of will and the knowledge that her baby needed her to survive. Then, miraculously, they hit something that did not move, something Kane was able to grab with one hand while keeping his other arm locked around Josephine's body. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of the water, and Josephine felt him pulling them both toward whatever he had found. Her vision was blurred with rain and river water, but gradually she realized he had caught hold of a large cottonwood tree that stood on a piece of elevated ground behind the church. The water was still dangerously high, but here it was not as violent, and Kane was able to get his footing and drag them both onto the muddy slope. "The church," Josephine tried to say, but Kane shook his head. "Water is too high now. We cannot get to the door." He looked around desperately, and Josephine followed his gaze to see that they were on a small island of safety, perhaps 20 feet across, where the ground rose just high enough to stay above the flood. The church itself was surrounded by at least 3 feet of rushing water that showed no signs of receding. They were trapped here, with no shelter except the tree and no help coming until the storm passed. Another contraction hit, this one so intense that Josephine cried out despite her determination to stay quiet. She doubled over, and Kane caught her again, lowering her carefully to the ground beneath the cottonwood, where the spreading branches provided some protection from the driving rain. "How close together are the panes?" Kane asked, and there was something in his voice now, a forced calm that told Josephine he was terrified but trying not to show it. "Very close," she admitted, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "I am sorry. I am so sorry you are caught in this." "Do not apologize," Kane said fiercely. "You listen to me, Josephine Olsen. I have delivered calves and foals and even helped a mare through a breech birth in a lightning storm. A baby cannot be that different. We are going to get through this, you hear me?" Josephine wanted to believe him, wanted to draw strength from his confidence, but fear clawed at her throat. This was not how it was supposed to be. She was supposed to give birth in a clean bed with the midwife attending, not on muddy ground in the middle of a flood with a stranger she had met only minutes ago. But her baby did not care about her plans or her fears, and she felt the overwhelming urge to push that meant ready or not, willing or not. This child was coming into the world. "I need to push," she gasped, and Kane immediately began moving, removing his heavy coat despite the rain and spreading it on the ground. "Lie back on this," he instructed. "It is the best I can do for now." He removed his vest as well, folding it to create a pillow for her head, working with swift efficiency that spoke of a man accustomed to making do in difficult circumstances. When Josephine was positioned as comfortably as possible given the situation, Kane moved to kneel between her legs, his face set with determination. "I need to see what we are dealing with. I know this is not proper, but proper went out the window when that flood hit. Your baby needs to be born safe, and that is all that matters now." Josephine nodded, beyond modesty, beyond everything except the primal need to bring her child into the world. Kane helped her remove the necessary undergarments, and she saw his expression change as he examined her. "I can see the head," he said, and there was wonder in his voice now mixing with the fear. "You are doing fine, Josephine. When the next pain comes, you push with everything you have got. Understand?" The next contraction built like a wave, and Josephine bore down with all her strength, feeling her body stretch and burn in ways that made her want to scream. But she gritted her teeth and pushed until spots danced in her vision and her lungs burned for air. When the contraction finally released her, she fell back gasping, and Kane's hand found hers, squeezing tight. "That was good," he said. "Real good. I can see more of the head now. A few more pushes and we will have your baby." The rain continued to pour down. The floodwaters continued to rage around their small island of safety, and lightning split the sky with terrible beauty as Josephine labored to bring forth life in the midst of nature's fury. Kane stayed with her through every contraction, coaching her when to push and when to rest, using his hands to support the baby's emerging head, murmuring encouragement that kept her focused when pain threatened to overwhelm her completely. "One more big push," Kane said, his voice tight with concentration. "The head is almost through. You can do this, Josephine. You are the strongest woman I have ever met." Josephine did not feel strong. She felt like she was being torn apart, like her body could not possibly stretch any further without breaking. But she thought of Thomas, of his smile and his dreams for their child, and she found reserves of strength she had not known existed. When the next contraction came, she pushed with everything she had left, screaming her defiance at the storm and the flood and the cruelty of fate that had left her alone. And then, suddenly, there was release. The baby slipped free into Kane's waiting hands, and Josephine heard a sound that was more beautiful than any music, the thin, angry wail of a newborn protesting its entrance into the cold, wet world. "It is a boy," Kane said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You have a son, Josephine." Through tears and rain, Josephine saw Kane working quickly, using his shirt to wipe the baby's face and mouth, wrapping the tiny body in the remains of her petticoat to provide some warmth. He tied off the umbilical cord with strips of cloth torn from his own clothing, then carefully cut it with a knife he sterilized, as best he could with whiskey from a flask in his pocket. Every movement was gentle but sure, and when he finally placed the baby in Josephine's arms, she looked up at this stranger who had become her savior and felt something shift in her chest, something that went beyond gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, cradling her son against her breast, trying to shelter him from the rain with her body. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile, but his cries were strong and healthy, and when she opened her dress to let him nurse, he latched on with fierce determination. Kane quickly put his wet shirt back on, and then removed his outer work shirt, creating a makeshift tent over Josephine and the baby to provide some protection from the elements. He sat close beside them, using his body to block the worst of the wind, and Josephine could feel warmth radiating from him despite the cold rain. "What will you name him?" Kane asked softly, watching the baby with an expression of such tenderness that Josephine felt her heart squeeze. "Thomas," she said without hesitation, "after his father, Thomas Michael Olsen." Then she looked up at Kane, at this man who had risked his own life to save hers, who had delivered her child with hands meant for roping cattle and breaking horses, who sat here in the mud and rain as if there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be. "But his middle name will be Kane, if you do not mind, so he will always know who brought him safely into this world." Kane's eyes glistened with moisture that might have been rain or might have been tears. "I would be honored," he said roughly, "more honored than you could know." They sat together on that small island of higher ground while the storm raged on, while the flood waters churned and swirled around them, while the sky threw down lightning and thunder as if angry at the world. Josephine kept baby Thomas tucked close, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way his eyes tried to focus on her face. Kane stayed beside them, vigilant and protective, watching the water levels and scanning for any sign of rescue. It was nearly 2 hours before the rain began to ease, before the flood waters started their slow recession, before they heard voices calling out from the direction of the church. Kane stood and shouted back, waving his arms, and soon a boat appeared, rowed by 3 men from town who had been searching for survivors. "Good Lord," one of them said when they drew close enough to see Josephine and the baby. "She had the child out here." "She did," Kane said with unmistakable pride. "And he is healthy and strong, just like his mother." Getting Josephine and the baby into the boat was a delicate operation, but Kane managed it with the same careful competence he had shown throughout the ordeal. He climbed in last, still shielding them from the weather, and Josephine leaned against him because she was simply too exhausted to sit upright on her own. She felt his arm come around her shoulders, steadying her as the boat pushed off toward the church where the water was now low enough to wade through. The town of Wilcox looked like a disaster had struck, which indeed it had. Buildings were damaged, possessions scattered and ruined, livestock lost to the flood. But miraculously, no human lives had been claimed, and when people saw Josephine with her newborn son, when they heard the story of the birth on higher ground, they gathered around with wonder and congratulations that felt like a benediction. The midwife, Mrs. Chen, who had been trapped in her house by the flood, took charge immediately, insisting that Josephine and the baby be brought to her home for proper care. Kane carried Josephine himself, refusing to let anyone else take on the task, and he stayed while Mrs. Chen examined both mother and child and pronounced them healthy despite the circumstances of the birth. "You did good work," Mrs. Chen told Kane, her weathered face creasing with approval. "Not many men could have kept their heads in such a situation. This baby owes you his life." Kane looked uncomfortable with the praise, shuffling his feet like a schoolboy. "I just did what needed doing," he muttered, but his eyes kept drifting to Josephine where she lay in a clean bed with Thomas sleeping peacefully beside her. "You should rest," Mrs. Chen said to Kane. "There is a room upstairs you can use. You are not going anywhere until you have dried off and had a hot meal." Kane looked like he wanted to argue, but exhaustion was written in every line of his body. "I should check on my crew, let them know I am all right." "Already done," Mrs. Chen said briskly. Your trail boss came by an hour ago. He knows you are here and told you to take whatever time you need. She gave him a knowing look. Said something about how a man does not deliver a baby and then just ride off like nothing happened. Kane's ears turned red, but he nodded and allowed himself to be led upstairs. Josephine watched him go, feeling oddly bereft when he disappeared from view. She told herself it was simply the emotional aftermath of the birth, the natural bond that formed between people who survived a crisis together, but deep down she knew it was more than that. In those desperate hours on the muddy slope, with floodwaters raging and new life emerging, something had connected between them that went soul deep. She slept fitfully that night, waking every time Thomas stirred, marveling each time that he was real, that he was here and healthy despite everything. Mrs. Chen checked on them frequently, bringing water and food, helping Josephine learn to nurse properly, offering the kind of practical wisdom that only came from delivering hundreds of babies over decades of practice. In the morning, Josephine woke to find Kane sitting in a chair beside her bed, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He had bathed and shaved, his dark hair still damp, wearing clean clothes that someone must have lent him since his own had been ruined by the flood. He looked younger in the morning light, and Josephine realized he could not be much older than her own 22 years, perhaps 24 or 25 at most. I hope you do not mind, Kane said quietly, gesturing to the chair. Mrs. Chen said I could sit with you while you slept. I wanted to make sure you and the baby were truly all right. We are, Josephine said, touching Thomas's soft hair with one finger. Thanks to you. She looked at Kane directly, wanting him to understand the depth of what she felt. You saved both our lives yesterday, Kane Jackson. I do not know how I can ever repay that debt. There is no debt, Kane said firmly. Any decent man would have done the same. But not every man could have done what you did, Josephine countered. Most men would have panicked or made mistakes. You stayed calm and knew exactly what to do. She paused, gathering her courage. Where will you go now? Back to the cattle drive. Kane was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face. The drive moves out tomorrow, heading north to Colorado. I signed on for the whole journey, which means I will be gone at least 2 months. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But Mrs. Chen told me about your situation, about your husband passing and you being alone out at that cabin. Josephine, you cannot go back there by yourself, not with a newborn baby and no one to help you. I do not have much choice, Josephine said, though the thought of returning to that empty cabin, to those long, lonely nights with only memories for company, made her chest tight with dread. I have no family here, no one I can impose upon. Thomas and I will manage somehow. You could come to Colorado, Kane said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if he had been holding them back and could not contain them any longer. The ranch I work for, they are always looking for good people. You could find work there, a place to stay. It is a better place to raise a child than out here in the middle of nowhere. Josephine stared at him, stunned by the suggestion. Kane, I barely know you. Why would you make such an offer? Kane stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the muddy street where people were already beginning the work of cleanup and repair. When he spoke, his voice was low but intense. Yesterday, when I caught you on that street, when I felt that baby kicking inside you and saw the fear in your eyes, something happened to me. And then later, when you were bringing Thomas into the world, when you showed such courage and strength, I felt something I have never felt before. He turned to face her, and Josephine saw vulnerability in his expression that made her breath catch. I know it is too soon. I know you are still mourning your husband, but I cannot just ride away and leave you here alone. It would not be right. What are you saying? Josephine asked, though her heart was already pounding with understanding, with a hope she was afraid to acknowledge. Kane crossed back to the bed and knelt beside it, taking her hand carefully as if she were made of fragile glass. I am saying that in the space of a few hours, you and Thomas have become important to me. I am saying that I want to help you, to protect you, to be there for you both if you will let me. He took a shaky breath. I know I am just a cowboy with nothing to my name but a horse and a saddle, but I am a hard worker and I do not drink or gamble. I would treat you with respect and honor, and I would love that boy like he was my own. If you would consider it, if you would give me a chance to prove myself worthy, I would be the luckiest man alive. Tears streamed down Josephine's face, but they were not tears of sadness. She thought about Thomas, about the man she had loved and lost, and she knew with certainty that he would not want her to spend the rest of her life alone. He would want his son to have a father, would want Josephine to find happiness again. And looking at Kane, at this brave, kind man who had literally delivered her baby in the middle of a flood, she felt something she had thought was dead and buried stirring back to life. I cannot promise to fall in love with you quickly, she said honestly. My heart is still healing and I need time. I will give you all the time you need, Kane said quickly. I am a patient man, Josephine, I can wait. But I can promise to give you a chance, Josephine continued, squeezing his hand. And I think Thomas and I would very much like to go to Colorado with you if the offer is sincere. The smile that broke across Kane's face was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. It is sincere, the most sincere thing I have ever said in my life. Thomas chose that moment to wake with a cry, and both Kane and Josephine laughed at his timing. Kane watched with fascination as Josephine nursed the baby, asking tentative questions about what it felt like, and whether it hurt, and marveling at the whole process of how such a tiny person knew instinctively what to do. Mrs. Chen came in with breakfast and raised her eyebrows at the sight of them together, but she said nothing, just set down the tray with a knowing smile. The trail boss stopped by again, she told Kane. He said he can give you 3 days here before the drive has to move on. If you decide not to continue with them, he will pay you for the work you have done and wishes you well. Kane looked at Josephine, a question in his eyes, and she nodded slowly. 3 days is enough time for me to get my strength back. And Mrs. Chen, would you know someone who might want to buy the Olsen place? I will not be needing it anymore. Mrs. Chen's smile widened. I might know someone. Let me ask around. Over the next 3 days, Josephine watched as Kane proved every word he had said was true. He helped coordinate the sale of her cabin and property to a young couple just arrived from Kansas, getting her a fair price that gave her some savings to start her new life. He spent hours with Thomas, learning to change wet cloths and calm the baby when he fussed, showing a patience and gentleness that made Josephine's heart soften more each day. He talked to her about his life, about growing up on a small ranch in Texas before his parents died of fever, about working his way north following cattle drives and seasonal work, always searching for a place that felt like home. And Josephine talked too, telling him about Thomas, about the love they had shared and the dreams they had built together. Kane listened without jealousy, holding her when she cried, saying he was honored that she would share those memories with him. He told her he had no intention of trying to replace Thomas in her heart or in baby Thomas's life story, but that he hoped to create new memories and new dreams that could exist alongside the old ones. On the 3rd day, they stood together outside Mrs. Chen's house, watching as the last of the flood debris was cleared from the streets. The sun shone bright and hot, as if the storm had never happened, though the evidence of its fury was visible in damaged buildings and altered landscapes. "Are you sure about this?" Kane asked, looking down at Josephine, who held baby Thomas against her shoulder. "Once we leave with that cattle drive, there is no easy way to come back. If you have doubts, you need to tell me now." Josephine looked at her son, at his peaceful sleeping face, and then up at Kane, at the man who had become their protector and friend. "I am sure," she said. "Whatever is waiting for us in Colorado, it has to be better than staying here alone. And besides, I think Thomas would like to grow up knowing the man who brought him into the world during the worst flood in years." Kane's hand found hers, and their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had been holding hands for years instead of days. "I will take care of you both," he promised. "That is a vow I make before God and anyone who cares to hear it. You and Thomas are my family now, and I protect what is mine." The cattle drive north was slow and dusty, but the trail boss had arranged for a wagon where Josephine could ride with the baby, making the journey as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. The other cowboys were initially skeptical of having a woman and infant along, but they quickly warmed to Josephine's quiet competence and Thomas's sweet nature. Kane rode beside the wagon whenever he could, and at night he slept beneath it to be close in case Josephine or the baby needed anything. As the days turned into weeks and Arizona gave way to New Mexico, and then Colorado, Josephine felt herself healing in ways that went beyond the physical recovery from childbirth. The constant motion, the changing landscape, the camaraderie of the crew, all of it worked together to ease the sharp edges of her grief and make room for new feelings to grow. She found herself watching for Kane throughout the day, found herself smiling at his jokes and relying on his judgment and missing him when he had to ride ahead with the herd. Kane, for his part, was unfailingly patient and respectful, never pushing for more than Josephine was ready to give. But she saw the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, saw the tenderness in his face when he held Thomas, heard the longing in his voice when he spoke about the future. He loved her already, Josephine realized. Completely and without reservation, this man had given her his heart after knowing her only days, and the weight of that devotion was both terrifying and precious. One night, about 6 weeks into the journey, Josephine sat by the campfire nursing Thomas while the men played cards and told stories. Kane sat nearby, whittling a small toy from a piece of wood he had been working on for days. The night was clear and cool, the stars spread across the sky in a glittering blanket, and Josephine felt a peace settle over her that she had not known since before her first husband died. "Kane," she said softly, and he looked up immediately, always attuned to her voice. "Come walk with me." He set aside his whittling and helped her up, taking Thomas from her arms so she could stretch her legs. They walked away from the fire, toward where the horses grazed peacefully in the darkness, and for a while they just stood together in comfortable silence. "I have been thinking," Josephine said finally, "about what you said back in Wilcox, about giving you a chance to prove yourself worthy." Kane went very still beside her. "Yes, you do not need to prove anything anymore," Josephine continued, turning to face him. "You have shown me every day through your actions who you are. You are kind and patient and good with Thomas. You work hard and treat everyone with respect. You make me laugh when I thought I would never laugh again, and you give me hope for the future when I thought my future died with Thomas Sr." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his evening stubble beneath her palm. "I am not all the way healed yet, and there are still days when grief catches me by surprise. But I want you to know that my heart is opening to you, Kane Jackson. Slowly but surely, I am falling in love with you." Kane made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, pulling her into his arms with Thomas nestled safely between them. "Josephine," he breathed into her hair. "My beautiful, brave Josephine, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret those words." They stood there under the Colorado stars, holding each other and their baby, and Josephine felt Thomas Sr.'s memory settle around them like a blessing rather than a burden. She knew her first husband would approve of Kane, would be grateful that someone was there to love and protect the family he had left behind. When they reached the ranch 3 days later, a sprawling operation at the base of the Rocky Mountains, the owner took one look at Kane's face and offered him a permanent position on the spot. He also provided a small cabin on the property where Josephine and the baby could live. A cozy 2-room structure with a real wood floor and glass windows that looked out over green meadows. Josephine stood in the doorway of that cabin with Thomas in her arms, watching Kane unload their few possessions from the wagon, and she felt tears of gratitude prick her eyes. This was more than she had dared to hope for during those dark days after her husband's death. This was a home, a future, a second chance at happiness. That evening, after they had settled in and fed Thomas and made the cabin as comfortable as possible, Kane built a fire in the stone fireplace and they sat together on the floor in front of it. Thomas slept in a cradle one of the ranch hands had brought over, his tiny fists curled beside his face, completely oblivious to the adults who watched over him so carefully. "I want to do this right," Kane said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a simple gold band, old and worn but clearly precious. "This was my mother's wedding ring. It is the only thing I have left of her, and I want you to have it." He took Josephine's hand, his green eyes serious and full of emotion. "I know we have done everything backward, know that we started with the hardest parts and are working our way back to the beginning. But I do not care about convention or what people might think. Josephine Olsen, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise to love you and Thomas with everything I have, to provide for you both, to honor your past while building our future together. I promise to be patient when you need time, strong when you need support, and present every single day of our lives. What do you say?" Josephine looked at the ring, at Kane's hopeful face, at baby Thomas sleeping peacefully nearby, and she felt the last pieces of her broken heart click back into place. This was right. This was meant to be. Sometimes life took everything away, but sometimes, if you were very lucky, it gave back something even more precious than what you had lost. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Kane Jackson. I will be your wife and you will be Thomas's father, and we will build a life together that honors where we came from while reaching toward where we are going." Kane slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years just for her. Then he cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her with a gentleness that made her heart soar. It was not the passionate kiss of new lovers, but something deeper, a promise and a commitment sealed with their lips. They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit preacher who came through the area, standing up in front of the ranch hands and the owner's family and Mrs. Chen, who had made the journey from Wilcox to see them wed. Josephine wore a simple blue dress that one of the ranch wives had altered to fit her, and Kane wore his best clothes with his hair slicked back and his face shining with joy. Baby Thomas, now 3 months old, gurgled happily in Mrs. Chen's arms throughout the ceremony, as if giving his blessing to the union. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to live together and navigate the intimacy of sharing space and life. Kane was endlessly patient with Josephine's occasional moments of grief, holding her when she cried, and never making her feel guilty for loving Thomas Sr., even as she grew to love him. And Josephine marveled at Kane's capacity for love. The way he threw himself wholeheartedly into fatherhood despite having no experience, learning from his mistakes and celebrating every small victory. Thomas thrived in the mountain air, growing chubby and healthy, his personality emerging more each day. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and he clearly adored Kane, reaching for him whenever he came into view and laughing at his silly faces and songs. As the months passed and turned into a year, Josephine felt herself becoming fully whole again. The memories of Thomas Sr. were still there, still cherished, but they no longer dominated her every thought. She found joy in the present, in watching her son learn to sit up and then crawl and finally take his first wobbly steps. She found satisfaction in making their cabin into a true home, in cooking meals and tending a garden and being part of the ranch community. And she found love, deep and abiding, in Kane's arms every night, in his laughter every morning, in the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. One evening in the spring of 1888, exactly 1 year after Thomas's dramatic birth, Josephine stood at the door of their cabin watching Kane play with their son in the yard. Thomas was walking confidently now, chasing after Kane, who pretended to run away, letting the boy catch him, and then scooping him up with exaggerated groans about how big and strong he was getting. The sound of Thomas's laughter rang out across the meadow, pure and joyful, and Josephine felt her heart swell with love so intense it almost hurt. Kane caught her watching and walked over with Thomas on his hip, both of them flushed and happy from their play. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, dropping a kiss on her forehead. "I am thinking about that day in Wilcox," Josephine said, taking Thomas's hand and marveling as always at how much he had grown. "About the flood and the fear and not knowing if we would survive. And I am thinking about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the greatest blessings." Kane shifted Thomas to his other hip and put his free arm around Josephine, pulling her close. "I think about that day too," he admitted. "I think about how close we came to losing everything before we even knew what we had. But we did not lose it. We fought and we held on and we made it to higher ground." "Higher ground," Josephine repeated, liking the metaphor. "That is where we are now, is it not? Above the flood waters, safe and together." "Together," Kane agreed, and then he hesitated, as if weighing whether to say something more. "Josephine, there is something I need to tell you. The ranch owner called me in yesterday. He is getting older and his children have no interest in ranching. He is looking for someone to take over operations eventually, someone he can train to run the place when he retires." Josephine pulled back to look at him, seeing the mix of excitement and uncertainty in his face. "He wants you to do it. He offered me the position," Kane said carefully. "It would mean more responsibility, longer hours, but also better pay and eventually a percentage of the profits. It would mean real security for us, for Thomas, for any other children we might have. But it would also mean we are committed to staying here long term, putting down real roots." I told him I needed to discuss it with my wife before giving an answer. Josephine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, at the respect he showed for her opinion, and the acknowledgement that this was their decision to make together. She looked around at the cabin they had made into a home, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the meadows where cattle grazed peacefully. She thought about the community they had become part of, the friends they had made, the life they were building day by day. "I think we should accept," she said firmly. "This is our home now, Kane. This is where we belong, and I cannot imagine a better place to raise our family." Kane's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "Our family," he repeated, and then his eyes widened as the full meaning of her words registered. "Josephine, are you saying what I think you are saying? Josephine laughed at his expression, at the hope and wonder written so clearly on his face. "I am saying that by winter, Thomas is going to have a little brother or sister. I am saying that this family is growing, and we are going to need that extra security." Kane let out a whoop of joy that startled Thomas into laughter, and then he was spinning them both around, dancing in the yard like a madman while Josephine laughed and held on and felt happiness bubble up inside her like a spring. When he finally set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, not caring who might see, pouring all his love and joy and gratitude into that single kiss. That night, after Thomas was asleep and they lay together in their bed, Kane rested his hand on Josephine's still flat stomach and talked about the future. He spoke about teaching both children to ride, about making sure Thomas never forgot the father who gave him life, but also knew the father who chose to raise him. He talked about building a bigger house someday, about maybe getting a dog, about growing old together and watching their grandchildren play in these same meadows. Josephine listened and added her own dreams to his, painting a picture of a life rich with love and laughter and hard work and satisfaction. It was not the life she had planned when she married Thomas Sr., but it was a good life, a blessed life, and she was grateful beyond measure for every moment of it. The baby girl was born in December, delivered by Mrs. Chen in the comfort of their cabin with Kane pacing anxiously outside. They named her Rose, and she had Kane's green eyes and Josephine's dark hair and a cry that could wake the dead. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from changing her to rocking her to sleep, and Kane joked that they were raising the world's youngest nursemaid. Over the following years, the ranch prospered under Kane's management, growing and expanding until it became one of the most successful operations in Colorado. Kane proved to have a natural head for business to go along with his skills as a cowboy, making smart decisions that increased profits while treating the ranch hands fairly and building loyalty. Josephine became known throughout the region for her kindness and wisdom, always ready to help a neighbor in need or nurse someone through illness. She never forgot what it felt like to be alone and desperate, and she made sure no one in their community ever felt abandoned the way she had before Kane came into her life. They had 2 more children over the years, another boy and another girl, and their cabin grew into a sprawling ranch house with room for everyone. Thomas grew tall and strong, learning the ranching business from Kane and showing every sign of being able to take over the operation someday. He knew the story of his birth, knew about the flood and the cowboy who delivered him on higher ground, and he was proud of his unusual entry into the world. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kane took Josephine back to Wilcox. The town had rebuilt after the flood, stronger and more prosperous than before, and they visited Mrs. Chen, who was retired now but still sharp as a tack. They stood together where the church had been, on that small rise of higher ground that had saved their lives, and remembered. "Do you ever regret it?" Kane asked quietly, holding her hand. "Do you ever wish things had been different, that you had not been caught in that flood, that you had not needed a stranger's help?" Josephine turned to him, this man who had become her whole world, and smiled. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for one single second. That flood brought you to me, Kane. It gave me you and this beautiful life and our children and everything I hold dear. If I could go back and change things, I would not. I would do it all again, exactly the same way." Kane pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I love you," he said simply. "I loved you from the moment I saw you standing on that porch with your hand on your belly. I loved you through the storm and the flood and the birth and every day since. And I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if such things are possible." "They are possible," Josephine said, thinking of Thomas Sr., of how love transcended death and time and lived on in the children who carried pieces of those who came before. Love never dies, Kane. It just grows and changes and becomes part of everything we are. They returned to the ranch that evening to find their children waiting. Thomas now, a young man of 14, helping Rose wrangle the two youngest who were covered in mud from playing by the creek. The house was warm with lamplight and the smell of dinner cooking. And as Josephine stood on the porch looking at this scene, at this life she had built from the ashes of tragedy, she felt Thomas Sr.'s presence one last time, a whisper in her heart that said he was proud of her, that he was happy she had found love again, that he was at peace knowing his son was loved and cared for. "Thank you," she whispered to the memory, to the man she had loved first and would always hold a place for in her heart. "Thank you for Thomas, and thank you for letting me go so I could find Kane." Then she walked inside to her family, to the noise and chaos and love that filled every corner of their home. Kane looked up as she entered and smiled that smile that still made her heart skip after all these years, and she thought about how far they had come from that desperate day in Wilcox. They had started on higher ground during a flood, bringing new life into the world against all odds, and they had stayed on higher ground ever since, building a marriage and a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was not the story Josephine had expected to live, but it was the one she had been given, and she embraced every chapter of it with gratitude and joy. The years continued to pass in the blessed way of happy lives, with seasons turning and children growing and love deepening with time. Kane became a grandfather at 50, when Thomas married a rancher's daughter from the next valley and gave them a grandson they named Kane Thomas. Josephine held that baby boy and felt the circle complete, life continuing in its mysterious and wonderful way. She and Kane grew old together on the ranch they had built, watching Colorado change and modernize around them while they held fast to the values and ways that had served them well. They sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set behind the mountains, content in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. When Kane died at 73, peacefully in his sleep after a long and full life, Josephine mourned him with the same intensity with which she had loved him. But she did not break, because he had given her strength and faith and a family that surrounded her with support. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren born, long enough to tell them all the story of how their great-grandfather delivered their grandfather during the worst flood in years, on higher ground where they were safe. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who were Kane's true legacy, Josephine Olsen Jackson died with a smile on her face and love in her heart. She had lived 2 great loves in one lifetime, had survived tragedy and found joy, had brought forth life in the midst of flood waters and built a dynasty on higher ground. The ranch continued on, passed down through generations who never forgot the story of how it all began, with a cowboy and a pregnant widow, and a flood that brought them together. And on spring days when storms rolled across the Colorado plains, when rain fell hard and creeks ran high, the family would gather and remember the courage and love that had started it all, grateful for the higher ground their ancestors had found and held on to, building something beautiful from chaos, creating light from darkness, choosing hope when all seemed lost.